as an exile, you live between two worlds. You are nowhere at home. And art and literature can then offer something to hold on to, can be a means by which to process your experiences and to maintain the connection with the past and the country that you have lost. 3 authors will speak about writing in exile. The experiences are first-hand, completely different, and yet identical. Unfortunately, Aslı Erdoǧan had to cancel this morning for health reasons. We're really sorry about that. But fortunately, Süleyman Adonya was willing to step in. And those of you who were at Bozar last night have witnessed that he's first and foremost a writer. But he also has experience on writing in exile because of his personal background, as well as the Writing Academy for Refugees and Asylum Seekers he founded here in Brussels. He will be joined on stage by Antonythasan Jesuthasan, who is writer, actor, and former child soldier, and Russell Banks, splendid American writer, but also founder and president of Cities of Refuge North America. Guy Goris of Mo magazine will host the event. And there is also an empty chair on stage, and that's for the Libyan writer Monema Joub, whom we have invited last year to be our icon writer in residence. And that's a residency scheme for writers under threat who need a safe space to be able to concentrate on their work. So far, it has been impossible for him to get a visa. He was supposed to be here with us at a festival, and we truly regret this is not the case. This event is supported by many partners, by Mo magazine, by Icon, Imagine, Ben Belgique, Ben Vlaanderen, De Markte. But I would especially like to thank Literary Europe Live Plus for producing this. This European project, of which Passaporta is one of the partners, holds its partner meeting here in Brussels during the festival. And it's especially focusing how literary organization can be as inclusive as possible. I enjoy you to have an interesting talk, and there will be book signing afterwards, and I hope you have a great festival. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. From here on, we will be talking with each other in English. The 3 writers join me on stage, and we keep the seat ready for any of the writers, authors that were invited but could not come because of visa problems. Just putting this away because I would like to see you rather than the bench. I had some introduction, but you already had an introduction, so we'll skip that one. Happy to have you with us for this, what we call the Mo lecture within the Passaporta Festival. And I'm really happy to have 3 extremely interesting writers with me on stage. And instead of reading long resumes and lists of books that they wrote, both fiction and non-fiction and essays and screenplays and movies and what have you, they've all involved in very different parts of what literature and storytelling actually produces in our day. I asked them just when they arrived here 20 minutes ago that they would introduce themselves briefly with talking 2 minutes about one of their characters. That brings the imagination of the writer immediately front stage, and I thought that would be a good starting point. So let's start Russell Banks with you. Russell Banks comes all the way from the United States. He's considered as the John Steinbeck of his generation, of our generation, has been prolific in writing and in being part of the literature community, involving himself far beyond writing. But Russell, maybe your character, please.
My character. That's actually a very difficult question because it took me something like 5 years and 400 pages to actually capture this character that I'm going to speak of. Reduce it to 2 minutes is hard. The character is Bob Du Bois in American English, or Bob Dubois, who is the a central figure, one of two central figures in the novel Continental Drift. And it was published in 1985, written in 1982 through 85. And it's a story of migration, which leads us to the theme, perhaps, of this meeting in some ways. Two kinds of migration in the United States. External migration into the United States, because the novel tracks the route of a Haitian woman and her child out of Haiti into South Florida. And internal migration, because it tracks the route of this man, Bob Du Bois, a white working class man from the northeastern industrial small towns, the kind of people who ended up voting in many ways, in most ways, for Donald Trump, but this was '82, you remember, coming down and migrating to what we call the Sun Belt. Believer in the American dream and the belief that if you change your location within America, you can somehow realize that dream if you haven't already realized it where you live. And so it's the story of this man's gradual route through debt and disappointment in his ability to realize that dream, to corruption and crime, ultimately, smuggling refugees from Haiti into the United States, and the collision between the two, which occurs in South Florida, in the waters off South Florida. Not unlike the migrations that are coming across from North Africa and from the Middle East into Western Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. That puts us indeed straight into a lot of questions that we will have to return to. Nice character, Bob Dubois. Suleiman Adonia, can you introduce us to one of your characters, please?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, I'm really pleased to be here. I think I would like to introduce you to two characters, because by the end, it took me 10 years to write the novel. And so when I arrived at the end, I no longer knew if they were actually two characters or one. And so the novel Silence is my mother tongue. It's set in a refugee camp in Sudan. And so it started off by being about siblings, a brother who was born mute. And so as a result, his parents couldn't send him to school. And they invested whatever little money they had into the education of his younger sister. And his younger sister, and so as a result, he grows up mute and illiterate. And so the whole novel takes place from the perspective of Saba. And so it's about her imagining him and his feelings and stuff like that. But slowly, the novel becomes about migration of desires and feelings between the two siblings. Questioning this idea of masculinity and femininity. And what we notice as the novel progresses is that, you no longer know who is the woman, who is the man in that kind of relationship between the two, And so there's, at one point in the novel, there's a marriage of compatibilities between the two, and almost they become one. So Hagos, his name is Hagos, and her name is Saba.
Okay, and Suleiman is Ethiopian British living in Brussels. So we're really
yeah. Eritrean. Three.
Eritrean. I thought I asked you Eritrean.
Ethiopian and Eritrean, both.
Okay. So we're building, those are building blocks of a cosmopolitan podium. We move forward to Sri Lanka and France with Antonythasan, Jesuthasan. And the same question for you, Antonythasan. Pick us one character. And you'll have to do better, because Russell started with 5 years of work. Then Suleiman had 10 years of work. So you better come up with a character that took 15 years in the making.
Good afternoon, everybody. First, I would like to say sorry, because my English is not very well. I am sorry, because English is not my first language, not second language, neither third language, neither fourth language. So, okay, one character, his name is Friday. One day, in Little Sri Lanka in France, maybe in the Gardinot area, in La Chapelle area, now people call Little India or Little Sri Lanka. So, I met one guy, he's 45 years old, 50 years old, and this man looked like an alcoholic and beggar. So that day, it was Friday. So I gave a name for that guy, that is Friday. So I follow this Friday. So this man stay in the street. He asked to the money, to the people, like begging, €1, €2, €3, like this. So I follow that all days. So finally, when he got some money, he buys some ritual things in the shops, in Hindu Tamil shops. He not bought alcohol or something, just some ritual things. Then he went to the metro in the underground. I followed to him. Then he did some ritual things for death, ritual things for the death. Then he got suicide. So the next day, I met him in the same metro. So I stopped that story in this point. So I published in Tamil. Then someone translated to French, Dutch, and English. So then this character always disturbing to me continually. So I wrote one screenplay. So last year we did one movie. It's a movie name is Friday and Friday. I did that Friday character. So now I become a Friday.
Okay, thank you very much. And we meet him on Saturday, so that's very conspicuous. Thank you very much, all three of you, for immediately opening up our minds to the imagination that comes with writing fiction, and at the same time, the reality that is embedded, that is crucial and central to a lot of fiction. Which brings me to my first broad question, maybe. Are there instances where you feel that the convictions or the stories that you write are being repressed, are being made impossible to distribute to either your people in Sri Lanka or in Ethiopia or Eritrea or Sudan or wherever? It's a different story maybe for the US, where there's no literal censorship. But maybe we start at that end of the discussion, because it would be the same for the audience here in Europe. We consider ourselves free of censorship. Does that mean that all convictions go, that all writing is free, that we have freedom of expression?
Well, I can speak, I guess, for myself, but I think I can generalize out of that in the United States, where, yes, there's no overtly politicized or institutionalized censorship. And yet there are two kinds of censorship which are operative on writers, and I felt it myself, experienced it myself, and I'll try to give an example. But, and they are cultural censorship and self-censorship. Example, I wrote a book published about now 4 or 5 years ago, a novel called Lost Memory of Skin, which is about a group of convicted sexual offenders in Miami, Florida, living under a bridge because they were forbidden by law to live anywhere within 200 yards where children might gather. And so they were a group of homeless men and boys, some of them were as young as 18 years old, who had been convicted of crimes as heinous as rape, child rape, to things as mild and erroneous, really, misdemeanors, convicted of, say, soliciting a 17-year-old or 18-year-old boy having sex with his 15-year-old girlfriend. So they ran the gamut like that, and they were pariahs, essentially, like living under a bridge, and this was quite true. I wrote a novel based on one of these characters' experiences, who was in fact a 22-year-old boy who was convicted in a sting, on internet sting, for soliciting what he thought was an 18-year-old or 17-year-old girl. And it was really an FBI agent. And he was convicted, spent 2 years in jail, and then when he was released, he was condemned to live under the bridge. All I'm saying now with regard to censorship, first, cultural censorship, that novel of all my novels has had the most resistant response from critics and from reviewers, from filmmakers or anybody interested in possibly adapting it to the screen or television. The book has essentially disappeared because the subject matter on the back of the cover is too frightening to the readership. They are too unwilling to find it in their hearts, which have been culturally conditioned, to find sympathy in their hearts for someone like this young man. Then there's self-censorship, and I think I have experienced that too on a personal level, and I know many of my fellow writers have, where you think there are certain subjects that I have to approach with great care now, and not just care, which one does anyhow. If I approach a racial or gender issues in writing, or sexual issues or political issues in my writing, I know I have to be careful simply because I'm a responsible writer, for no other reason than that. But I have to be careful beyond that, because I have to be aware that I'm more likely to offend my readers now than when I was writing at any other time in my life. And I've been writing since 1960. So that's over half a century.
Does that mean that that could refer to the political correctness debate?
Yes, identity politics and the political correctness debates, yes. And the overweening tendency of Americans particularly to identify with particular groups rather than as individuals. And so a writer then has to be aware that he or she is much more likely to cause offense than in the past, and take that on as a risk. I mean, the only way to avoid self-censorship is to refuse to censor yourself, and take that on. I do have and try to bear carefully the responsibility for dealing with people whose experiences, dealing in my fiction with people whose experience is very different from mine. And I have written about, African Americans, I've written about convicted sex offenders, I've written about women and children and so on, people who are very different from me in numerous ways. But I have always felt the responsibility to do my homework, do my research, and tread carefully.
Just briefly, does that mean that you're challenged to work harder on what you called your sympathy for the character, for the reality, or does it impede meeting of minds and building bridges even in your imagination?
I'm not sure. I think as a writer, all it does for me is force me to be aware of these winds that are blowing against me, and to resist them and to push back. And that's about as far as I can go, and that's the only kind of responsibility I feel I have to bear as a writer, as an artist.
Suleiman, would you consider the things that Russell Banks is talking about, how to navigate the sensitivities of communities and of groups of today, do you consider that a first world problem?
First of all, I think it's a really great answer you gave, Russell, because I think one of the notion is we need to challenge this idea that here in the West, we are free, you know? And I think especially as writers, because, you know, you only begin to analyze the problems that writers face by challenging the question itself. Because I definitely, when I came, you know, I lived in Sudan and then I lived in Saudi Arabia before I came to London. And, you know, so I know what censorship is in the actual political form. So when I came to the UK and I started to write, I thought, actually, I would face a lot, you know, I would be totally free to write what I really, really want to write, you know? But in a very ironic sense, I found actually myself to be more free than publishers, you know, because there was suddenly when I presented my work, there were all those sudden challenges, like we can't publish this because, you know, the kind of thing that Russell was talking about. And to me, that was like really disturbing, you know, this notion, like there is an industry out there that is actively trying to censor you. And that's why it took me 10 years to write this novel, because when I started writing it, and then I started writing it freely, and then I sent it to my agent, and one of the things she started saying to me, or, you know, Western readers won't get this, you know, Western readers would not understand a novel set in Africa, that this thing will happen in Africa, you know. This idea of assumption is extremely disturbing. And so here is me, you know, supposedly from two countries, like, or, you know, lived in Saudi Arabia, in Sudan, or, you know, dictatorship, where novels and books are banned. But what's the difference between that and when your Western agent will tell you, you can't write this, I'm not gonna sell this book, because a Western reader is not going to get this idea, this novel, you know? So she told me, we can only collaborate, or we can only go further if you try to change it. And so I said, no, you're not going to change it, and I left, right? And so it's really important that we continue to ask those questions, especially as readers, because the publishing industry like to have ideas of you know, of assumption about the Western readers, which are not necessarily true.
Yeah. Would it free you of that pressure, in a sense, if you would write in, I don't know what your mother tongue is, Amara or Oromo or whatever? Would that make you more free to write than when you try to enter the Anglophone writing sphere?
First of all, I don't have a mother tongue. I'm free from mother tongue. Well, you know, I left, I mean, that's why the novel is called Silence is My Mother Tongue. You know, does your mother? You know, there's an autobiographical notion to it, because my mom left when I was 3, and you know, my dad passed away when I was 2. So, you know, suddenly I had no parents from the age of 3, and I thought, like, you know, it was ironic. I felt silent, and that's a form of trauma that children happens to children. But anyway, so that was the point where I kind of, you know, looking back, I would say I completely freed myself from this idea that you need a mother tongue. So I can't answer that question, but I think what we're trying to say is that, you know, there is the Salman Rushdie story that is very popular, you know, be a banned novel and all that, but there's also the other side of the Salman Rushdie story that exists in the West. I don't think it matters whether you write in whatever language. For me, you know, I see myself as Western, and whatever language I choose to write in, I should not face the kind of censorship that some of us do.
Yeah. I was asking the question because I was thinking of Antonythasan, who told me that he continues to write basically in Tamil because he's speaking to the Tamils basically in Sri Lanka, but also in India. But that at the same time, you told me that you started to feel you could say what you wanted, write what you want, when you ended up in France. So that's a dilemma I found in the way that you presented yourself during the interview we did. So I would like to have your idea about where are you confronted with censorship or restrictions today, writing from France, basically in Tamil, being translated in different languages. Is there still something like censorship or restriction on your work?
So, I have left my country of origin for reasons of persecution 30 years ago. I never go back to Sri Lanka. So now I am in France. Yeah, I have freedom of expression because I am writing in Tamil. French government not understand my writing. So I am writing only Tamil. So, but I am writing to Tamil people. So I should send my work to Sri Lanka and India. So still, they banned my works, my films in India and Sri Lanka. You know, in Sri Lanka, last 30, 40 years, a very bad situation for freedom of expression. The government killed so many writers, journalists, artists. In India, so very latestly, 2-3 years back, this Hindutva parties got power. They killed, so very recently, 3 writers in India. So because they are against to the Hindutva ideology. There are no question about the freedom of expression. Now it's a basic question in India, freedom of eating to beef. So they banned beef in several places, several states. So it's going like that. So when I sent my books into Sri Lanka, they censored, they're not allowed. Even in India, so recently, last month, I got one, what can I do? And someone from tribunal, the case, because I wrote about the Rohingya Muslims. So, yeah, so when I go back to India, I should face this case. Yeah. Okay.
So there is, even though you're writing from Europe, you're still very much confronted with real political censorship of your work.
Yeah, and plus, even in France, I face so many threatening and several attacks by Sri Lankan, what I can call you, terrorist, Tamil nationalities, Tamil nationalist. Yeah.
Russell, you told me in the interview that we had that even in the United States, there's almost a movement towards the underground for a lot of artists and writers who are confronted with restrictions, not so much of the cultural kind that you were talking about earlier, but the more economic kind that maybe Suleiman touched upon, the monopolies of distribution, which are commercial corporations these days. And you said there's a movement towards the underground. And we in Europe remember, at least people of my age, and I see there's a few younger ones, so maybe you don't remember Samizdat publications. Those were the underground publications in the Soviet bloc during the times of communism and heavy repression of writers. Is what you're seeing happening in the United States in any way comparable to that situation of the Samizdat publication?
Yeah, I think there's an alternative press, if you want to call it that. that has grown exponentially since the arrival of the internet. It is primarily digital format and presentation and access. And it's both sides. I mean, it's the same format and the same presentation and reception that is utilized by the extreme right and by the neo-fascist and neo-Nazi movements and the white supremacist movements in the United States. It's also being used increasingly by young artists and intellectuals who are preparing and presenting works of art and literature that would not have access in the mainstream press. And it is largely an economic factor. The gradual conglomeration of publishing companies in the United States and of media companies over the last 25 years has been more or less followed the same pattern as the conglomeration of the oil companies and of the food and drink companies and so forth, down to entirely controlled by 3 or 4, in the case of publishing, multinational, gigantic, bloated corporations. So yes, it's an alternative. It is developing and it's extending widely. If I were 20 years old or 25 years old and beginning my writing life, I would certainly turn to it and utilize it and bypass entirely the existing corporate and commercial structure for it, because the audience is there, the means of delivery is there, and it's parallel, I suppose, you could find in the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, and suddenly it was possible to bypass the monasteries to get your work out, and then you had ballads posted and printed overnight and posted on the walls of Europe.
And how does that new publishing platforms, how do they impact on formats? Because we know that the medium is the message, as Marshall McLuhan famously said. And so if writing leaves print, does that have an impact on the format, on the way of storytelling, and maybe even the tone and the content?
Well, I can only speak for the United States. I think in the United States, it's very interestingly leading to a more oral format. I've recently started listening to and becoming even addicted to podcasts. I love them. And I walk around with headphones on all the time, which is a little odd looking, I suppose, but and distracting. But as a result, the works that you're hearing in the podcasts are, even though they were originally written as texts, they have a more oral quality to them than if they were never going to be read aloud or never going to be received aloud. So there's a dramatic shift in the format and template that's used and diction, language. The informality that's available that way, I think, is all very interesting and good. I mean, I'm sort of a antediluvian myself in this manner, and I'm still writing out of early 20th century formats.
Does it help Suleiman, you're a young writer, and you're living not like Russell and me in a time when we started, we were happy to find a book to read. Writing and publishing is more floating, as Russell described today. Do you see that as an advantage? Can you even pass through the more formal kinds of censorship that I'm sure you encounter for your work in Africa, for instance?
First of all, you look too young for me. I mean, you guys, I mean, and also like all the storytellers are old in souls. So, but yeah, I mean, my recent publisher, for example, Indigo Press, is a small independent publishing house. but the editor is quite well-known and respected editor. You know, and so I think there's a movement from both sides. I think she used to be an editor at Jonathan Cape, and I think even some editors and publishers they've also realizing, like they've been constantly restrained by the demands of those kind of big you know, big corporation that Russell was talking about. And so they're going off and setting their own independent, you know, publishing house, because they realize actually there's a demand. There's not only young, but, you know, audience from all across the ages looking for something that is fresh, something that's new. And so they answering that demand, you know. And so I'm lucky to be with my editor, for example. You know, I'm lucky to experiment in this novel with all the format. You know, I have poems in it. I have everything that I really wanted to write in a novel, and she didn't stop me from having any of those things. So to me, that was really important. But I do see. You know, definitely, I mean, social media is a big thing, for example, you know, and it's a medium that I celebrate. I'm not an expert on it, but it's something that I see and realize. And for example, I'm on Twitter, and I'm always amazed by the quality of some of those tweets, you know. They're so funny, they're so hilarious. It's a skill, I think, you know, that demands respect, I guess, you know. And so there are, you know, obviously, if wherever you're from, you know, in Africa or Asia or, you know, even here, and so the social media, I think it's definitely does contribute to what's making us freer, I think. Yeah.
Antonythasan, in Europe, we still tend to think that we're the center of the world. That obviously shifted a century ago, and we're still not really up to date about it, and it's shifting again. What I wanted you to ask about is literature is so important in South Asia, and we hardly know anything about it. You told me that you go to Chennai every year for the Lit Fest. There are literary festivals in almost every major city in Pakistan and in India and Bangladesh even, or Sri Lanka. How important is literature for society? How important are writers for society?
So, my personal experience in my country, in Sri Lanka. So we faced last 40 years very bad war. So this war between the government and Tamil guerrillas and Indian government. So Indian government always involved in this war politically and military. So everyone killed up to the people. Everyone said lies, political lies, everything. But that 40 years, only writers, they keep the truth and bring out to the society, even in inner society and to the international society. So, you know, it's a very bad censorship is there. So they wrote fictions, they wrote poems, and so in the wartime, literature only keep some beliefs or something to us. We don't, because all instruments, I mean, states, religions, caste, military, international community, UNO, UNESCO, UNHCR, no one saves us. One genocide happened in 2009 in Sri Lanka. Only some writers and some poets, they wrote about this. They bring out of the country, they published.
Are you saying, are you using truth in the sense of facts?
Yeah.
Or is it something more, is truth in literature larger even than the facts?
No, no. They bring to the fact, but literature not a political statement. Literature always talks, even the Tamils and Sinhalese and Muslims, every point of view, and that's it. I cannot explain. Yeah,
Suleiman. Yeah,
I think that's a beautiful question. Can I just would like to jump in because I'll give you a personal example. Why literature is extremely important. So when I lived in Saudi Arabia, we all know, I don't need to introduce, the country or the censorship. It's a country that, so I was 10 when I moved to Saudi Arabia, and I lived there for about 5-6 years. There was so they literally banned all novels, and next to that, they would teach you, everything is about hate. Hating Christians, hating women, hating Jews, hating even Muslims, Sufis, other sects and stuff like that. And so for me, so as a child, when you grow up in that environment, it's really devastating because you end up hating the rest of the world. But I was so lucky that my brother befriended a smuggler, who smuggled novels into Saudi Arabia. And so suddenly I was 12 and I was reading those books like Charles Dickens, Virginia Woolf, Tayyip Saleh was a Sudanese novelist, for example, Kafka, so Jewish person in Saudi Arabia. And so the system of that country is designed to build all those boundaries through censorship. And what happened to us was that those books, those literature, have actually demolished all the boundaries. And so to me, it was an access to the rest of the world. It almost like traveling, it's almost like it was my passport. It's got me to the point where I felt I could belong in a world where we are all the same. And so that's why I see literature as my true home. I see literature as a universe.
And it's also is access to your own humanity. Because the dehumanization that you're describing by religion, by government, by economic powers and interests and so forth, that kind and by fanaticism, that kind of dehumanization is what all literature from the beginning of time to now is opposed to, is against. The purpose for me of all writing, it seems, and all art for that matter, is to dignify the humanity of each individual on the planet. In a way, not to say that we're all the same, but to say that we're all different and we're all of equal value.
And is that is the kind of experience that you want to bring across, or is literature the platform where you present that possibility of equality?
Well, it's the experience I had, just as you had when you started reading Charles Dickens and so forth, that you had as a child when you first started reading literature. It's the experience that I had discovering my own humanity and the humanity of everyone who surrounded me, even the people who were opposed to me and were trying to oppress me. And having had that experience then, when I became a writer, desired to become a writer, and then became a writer, I simply wanted to recreate that experience, both for myself and for others.
I think we just, and that's, to me, what literature does is gives you the nuances, the complexity of all of us, I mean, even within the family, we're different. I totally agree with that, and that's what it does. I mean, I met once with David Grossman, and and he was telling me about a period in his life when he was a lot younger, and that he couldn't care about Arabs, and and then he encountered Tayyip Saleh's novel, The Season of Migration to the North, about about Sudanese man, and he said, I felt this huge love for that person, for that character. And that was the beginning for him, you know, to kind of go beyond all the kind of boundaries that we are fed constantly about the rest of the world. Yeah.
Does that mean that literature or art, in a larger sense, can change the world?
One reader at a time, I suppose. I know that
The
I was
seven
changed, and therefore
billion
I
of
assume
us.
others can be changed. But
Of course,
yeah,
because I changed.
yeah,
because,
exactly. Yeah.
Because when I was 15 years old, I was joined with Tamil Tigers. I was guerrilla. I was a child soldier. So I lost my education. I left from my school. So my life like this in the jungle. So when I have started read the literature, yeah, it's my personal life, my political view, all view they changed. So now I am 51 years old. So I am against to the war. I am against to the all these nonsense things. Because I don't have any teachers. I never been in the university. I never been in the college. Nothing at all. Just I have read Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Maxim Gorky. Yeah. So only literature. I learn all values from the literature. Yeah.
Can I just say, because I think to me the question becomes more difficult when we, as writers, we come to the desk with this notion that we can't change the world. You know, that I totally disagree with, because to me, for example, you know, I always say I wrote the novel, the second novel, but I think the novel also written me, you know, rewritten me in a way. So I do think I agree with everyone here that literature has been my savior. But I don't think you know, as a writer, I personally don't go into the craft thinking I'm going to change anyone. I think I'm only, yeah.
No, Doris Lessing, the great British novelist, African novelist, said, things don't change at the center. They only change at the edges. Yeah. And then they work their way in. I lived through the 1960s very intimately involved with the civil rights movement. It didn't change in the White House. It changed way out at the edges, in the small towns of the South, southern United States, in the schoolyards, and then in the department stores and the restaurants and so forth, bit by bit by bit, until finally it changed at the center.
And is that how literature works?
I believe so, yeah.
On an individual scale, does it? And I'm asking the question because we're talking about writing in exile. So there is. It's not just something that, there's not just a conversation between the writer and the individual reader. There is this political context that involves itself with that conversation, that prohibits it, that censors it, that intervenes. So there must be something more to the story and storytelling than just the conversation between the writer and the reader.
Well, that's exactly what those at the center who hold power know. They know that the change is coming, and it's coming from out at the edges where the writers are. That's why they send them into exile in the first place. If you can only keep lopping them off at the edges, then maybe we can hold on to power a little bit longer.
But I also think, it's very interesting. You know, sometimes if this idea of writing in exile, to me, what makes it more interesting is when, you know, Eritreans, for example, in exile, or Ethiopian in exile, they would ask you, oh, because you know how to write, can you write this type of story, you know? Almost a love letter, because all exiled people walk around with nostalgia, you know, yearning and longing for their countries, you know? And to me, it's, you know, when I definitely wrote this novel, I didn't want to write a love letter. And, you know, I wanted to explore the society in the way I think it should be, you know. It doesn't matter whether that society lives in a city or in a refugee camp, like my characters do. And I think, so this is another, you know, an added layer of kind of self-censorship that you were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah. So we're talking about Exile, and I want to dig in a little bit deeper, because exile supposes national borders. If there wouldn't be nations, there would hardly be exile, because you would be in a fluid world where you could not maybe be escaped from a power, or the power could not persecute you. How important are borders for writers, I wonder? How much do they play in your work and in your relationship with readers and societies? Antonythasan. Yeah, we're talking about exile, for instance, and so I'm trying to understand how important nations are, and borders, and maybe separation walls for writers and for censorship or for freedom of speech. Do they matter, or are they totally out of your system?
It's a simple answer. No borders. For the writers, no borders. Yeah, that's it. Very simple answer.
There are no borders for writers, right?
No for, yeah.
Right.
Russell?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. When I began as a writer, I was, and still am, a white man from New England, born in 1940 and of my era in so many ways, and I identified as that. And the writers that mattered to me as a very young man and as a boy were writers probably who corresponded to that. White, from New England, like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Melville and figures like that. American, English, Anglophones, and so on. But as I grew older and I came to know other writers, especially writers who were not from New England, and then some who were not white, and some who were not male, and then some who weren't American either. And I realized we all do essentially the same thing and all bear essentially the same relationship to the powers that be, that was my country. My country was the country of writers, and these were my fellow citizens. And now, at this point, I feel as though what writers offer to the world, really, is a model of cosmopolitanism, of belonging to each other and to the world as a result.
I think from what I understand, this is really an important question, because I think, to me, it's a process that each writer has to take to get to that stage that Russell is talking about. And so, yes, there are a lot of boundaries to get to that stage where you actually transcend, you know, if you're a man writing about a woman, if you're a woman writing about a man, if you're a Muslim writing about Christian, you know, if you're straight writing about gay. And so it's not a simple process. So I definitely get what you're saying. And I think, to me, for example, when I started writing this novel, it took me 2 years of reading incredibly challenging books for me to break all the boundaries between the conscious and the subconscious, you know, the learned behavior. And those are the exile. So I had to exile myself from all the kind of cultural ideas and principles that has been installed in me. And to me, I see that, you know, I see this idea of migration, not only from countries, but within the self as well.
Which is a fundamental approach to both migration and exile and change. But there is a more practical one as well. I mean, there's an empty chair on the podium, and that is also talking about borders, even though in principle we can say there are no borders for writers, there are borders for people who write. There are writers who are thrown into jail, who are really persecuted. So you became president at a certain stage of the International Parliament of Writers, which then morphed into the ICORN, the cities of asylum for writers. How important are those kinds of acts of practical solidarity between writers?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's true. I'm glad we got to this aspect of the issue, the practical ones, and because that was what drew me into the International Parliament of Writers, was a sense that writers themselves could perhaps have an impact on the well-being and the safety of their fellows writers from elsewhere, especially those of us in North America and in Western Europe. And so establishing the safe houses in different cities in Western Europe and in North America was a way for me to do it. Writers are also notoriously ill-equipped to do practical things, and I found that out rather fast, including myself. But I struggled along with it for about 5 years, dedicated to this, and I was very happy when it was taken over by people who were more efficient than I and more capable of raising the funds and getting this job done. But it was a noble attempt, and I think it still is. The Cities of Refuge international program, and with what you said today, someone told me today, 71 safe houses for writers around the world now, mostly in Western Europe and also North America.
Just a practical fact to add there, Russell, is that both Passaporta and PEN are hosting those kinds of houses here in Belgium, but both houses are empty right now because of visa problems. Increasingly, European countries even refuse to have writers with proven persecution to give them long-term visa. So the practical points are being taken care of thanks to people who don't write novels but do things. But writers are persecuted, in danger, and what can we do as writers or as readers to protect them?
You want to speak? Either of you?
I don't know, because last 25 years, you know, from 1993, I am a refugee in France, so I traveled all of the world with that refugee document. So I spent my time in all airports, 5 hours, 6 hours, so inquiry. Last time it's happened, I think it's 3 weeks ago, when I come back from Sydney in the Singapore. It's a 5 hours inquiry. When I went to the Toronto Film Festival in 2016, they arrested to me in the Toronto airport. They cancelled my visa. And they took my passport. And they gave me 10-day temporary visa to attend to the festivals. So it's a very difficult, yeah, not only for the writers, all people, especially the Asian people and African people. It's a, I don't know. Yeah. It's a very difficult. I don't know what is the solution. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Suleiman?
It's a very difficult question, and because in Eritrea, for example, my mother's country, we have, like, I think, over 30 journalists, writers who are in prison. It's the only country in Africa without free press. And, you know, I founded a literary festival called the Asmara Ades Literary Festival in Exile, which debuted at Beaux-Arts in Feb. And one of the things I did is invite Vanessa Tashai, whose uncle has been imprisoned by the Eritrean government, and she was she gave the opening talk for the festival, and so she talked about her uncle. And I think it's, you know, I think every act, all of us here, from wherever we are, I think we have the chance to do, you know, to do the things, you know, to do whatever we can in terms of highlighting the issue, you know, signing petition, you know, and buying work of those people as well, and you know, following people like Vanessa, for example, whose uncle is in prison, and she is a great person who not only highlighting only her uncle's case, but also highlighting what all Eritreans are going through. And all of us as well. I mean, for me, when I write, I don't put politics into my work, but I'm outside my desk, outside my writing room. I'm definitely a citizen of this world.
And that adds to your literature, or is it completely separate?
I think now I've got into a stage where I'm really comfortable with the two. I mean, a lot of people, for example, they will call me and say, why you not writing political things, for example? But to me, everything is political, you know, the way we love, the way how we make love, the way we relate to each other, the way we talk to each other here, the way we see each other. You know, politics is not just about, you know, I mean, there are, for example, gay people in Africa who are being killed just for their sexuality, you know, and or here, you know, transsexual in the United States, trans women are being murdered all the time, and so, you know, there are a lot of issues, and for me, I'm at a stage where I'm really happy with how I've managed to run the two things together.
Russell.
Yeah, and I think we also, I say we, I mean everyone in this room and in every room listening, that we have to remember that, we have to not be so easily seduced by the stereotype of the writer in exile, which is that there is a writer, noble person who has been, who has offended a government somewhere and is in flight from that government, forced flight from that government. That's a kind of it's almost a glamorous figure in the West in some ways, in the media. And we are ourselves easily drawn into that. And we forget in the process that that writer also likely has a family that he or she has had to abandon and leave behind, people, children, spouses, parents who are under threat because of his or her exile, state of exile. That person is also faced with a language and economic situation that puts him or her in terrible disadvantage. We have to humanize, in other words, the exiled writer. Yeah. And I think it's easy not to. It's easy for us liberals to feel good about ourselves because we understand and sympathize with the exiled writer, and we forget the human dimensions of that person's life.
I think it's really important point because it's beyond providing the safe house, you know, the safe space. I mean, for example, in the UK in 2016, there were 100,000 books published. Only 100 were by writers of color, you know. And so if you have a person who is an exiled journalist, you know, living in the United States or United Kingdom, and if you're not giving him the chance or giving him or her the chance to publish their work, so that's totally.
Okay, we have to wrap this up. We're only starting, but an hour has passed. So I would like to thank Antonythasan, Jesuthasan, Suleiman, Antonia, and Russell Banks for being with us. Thank you very much for being with us also. Thank you.